stop looking at my email to see if I need to help anybody. I always let it go an extra minute if that's.
There is, I don't know if you saw Tom Reynolds, there is somebody, a Robin Johnson, who says
Yes.
I'll be driving. So
She was one of our great speakers. I'm so glad to see her about resilience.
Perfect to listen to then, right?
Yeah.
You should know, Tom, and that's not a bad thing. I was on a Zoom call with a bunch of people from the Department of Energy and a bunch of senior Pakistani officials, and we had somebody try to join our call claiming they were a graduate student conducting research, which means they were either in A, the CIA, or B, the Pakistani ISI, one or the other, or had allegiance to both. That's possible, I guess. And we kicked them off. So keeping a wary eye on who jumps on your call.
Yeah, that's right. By golly. By golly. All right, we'll give it 30 seconds more, and then I will start my spiel. That's okay.
Okay.
Oh, he got another. There we go. Hey, Mr. Grace, how are you feeling?
Not too bad, Tom. You might see me soon.
Hey, back on the bike.
Back on the bike, yeah. I'll try and be more careful this time.
Well, bike wreck.
What's that?
I've been doing a lot. Tom, Grace, I've been doing a lot of biking the last.
Yeah, good. I love it.
I just bought a new, let's just say, very expensive bike, but will not have to get it for another 3 months because they're so backed up.
Oh, the anticipation.
Yes, spring season out here. Spring season.
Where are you?
Pennsylvania.
Oh yeah.
I didn't ride today. It was 32 degrees outside.
Oh come on! I thought you were a tough guy.
The final word. This is a good lesson since we're a small group and being informal. And my friend Tom Vossler will agree with me. The number one lesson you learn after 30 years in the Army is you don't have to practice how to be miserable. It comes naturally.
True statement.
All right, I'm going to get this story rolling if that's okay. So welcome to NexGen, November, what is the date? November 20th, 2020. My name is Tom Reynolds, president of the Reynolds Group, and I will be your host for the next 45 minutes. NexGen is a peer network founded 20 years ago to support manufacturing, distribution, and tech companies. Our mission is to help business leaders adjust, leverage, and thrive. My background is manufacturing and software development. I use this experience to solve marketing problems and create better sales opportunities for clients, not just leads. My business partner is Hema Day. She's a financial CMO and manages our SEO to sales department, which is a financially driven digital marketing program. Helping me today is Linda Feinholtz. She's a business growth strategist and coach and a great friend. We welcome questions. It's a small group, so you can, probably raise your hand and jump in or put your questions into chat, and Linda will be managing that side of the board. Our speaker today is Tom McClausland and Jeff McClausland and Tom Vossler. Jeff, they're both retired Army colonels, I believe, yes. A really good friend and baseball lover, and Tom is was a cattleman from Pennsylvania. I'm going to read just a short little excerpt from what Jeff talks about. It's from his book. I've read his book, get his book, read his book. Both Tom and Jeff give a great review of both history and leadership. And you'll start off thinking you're reading about history, and when you finish, you'll understand you've really gotten a great leadership lesson. You may have never visited Gettysburg battlefield, but understanding historic lessons from Battle Tested, their book, will have a profound influence on not only your leadership abilities, but also your life, organization, and career. So with that, I'm going to hit the ball to Jeff. Take it away.
Okay, first of all, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for my friend Tom Vossler and I to be with you. My colleague, Holly Tiley, is monitoring this as well. She'll be monitoring the chat room. He decided to put a question in the chat room, and she's also recording it to provide that recording to Tom after the fact. I want to thank my good friend Tom Reynolds for organizing this and bringing you all to us, number one. Number two, I want to congratulate Tom in particular, and maybe more of you more broadly. I don't think I've spoken to Tom since the Dodgers finally won the World Series after trying so hard for so many years. Congratulations. I'm a Cubs fan, but I was glad to see, I'm glad to see the Dodgers, in fact, do that finally. And secondarily, we were chatting before all of you got on the call. It's a perfect day for us to do this because, of course, yesterday, November 19th was by my calculation, the 157th anniversary of the Gettysburg Address, which is a huge day down in Gettysburg, normally where Tom is from. I've organized a company called Diamond Six Leadership and Strategy, and we do executive leadership workshops for corporate groups all across the United States. And oftentimes we use historical case studies, our flagship one being Gettysburg. After Tom and I had done this for many, many years, we decided to try to use this case study in the creation of an actual book. So what we're going to do today is take you through an excerpt, if you will, or a taste of that book and the associated historical vignettes, and then be happy to take any questions. So to do that, I'm going to throw up a couple of slides because we're going to use some maps and stuff. And does that work okay, Holly, or have I got it wrong?
You got it.
Got it. Okay, great. So first and foremost, ladies and gentlemen, Ken Burns once said, as he was doing that award-winning documentary on the American Civil War, that everything before led to the Civil War and everything after it was a consequence. So if you think about using a historical event in broad terms for a case study about leadership, it certainly seemed that the Civil War was an appropriate one. Gettysburg, for us, a very appropriate one, because in many ways, one could argue it was a turning point within time in the military, had frequently been engaged in so-called military staff rides on the battlefield for military officers, which is a leadership development, but also one on tactics and strategy. So it's a focused effort in that as well. And over the years doing that, Tom and I agreed that this could be used for anyone just by focusing on the leadership aspects and less focusing on the military aspects. It is my firm conviction
we're frozen.
religious leadership or military leadership, there is just good leadership overall, number one. Number two is that if we all were we all went off to a major organization and spent time there, we can make some insightful comments about how well or how poorly it was run. But if we were there when it suffered a crisis, that good and bad leadership would stick out in bold relief. And that really, in many ways, is what a battle is. Two organizations, both of which are involved in a crisis. Obviously, if we're going to talk about leadership, you got to have a definition. We like this one. Leadership's the ability to decide what has to be done and get people to want to do it, provided by this gentleman here, Dwight Eisenhower. Obviously, a great leader, 5-star general, president of the United States twice. And you may not realize this, but also president of Columbia University from the time he leaves the Army until he becomes president. Secondly, of course, it's brief. You can remember that. And thirdly, I like the second half, get people to want to do it, because one might imagine if you've been 5-star general, you've been president of the United States, you've been the president of a major university, all you need to do is give orders and people leap to their feet and rush off with maximum alacrity and maximum effort. And we all know from running organizations, that's not the case. You have to a certain degree, try to get buy-in to get maximum performance. We oftentimes use these two words, management and leadership, interchangeably. I've tried to describe here how I think they're somewhat different. There is a Venn diagram, and the study of management goes back really to around the First World War with the creation of things like the MBA program at Harvard University. The study of leadership, formerly as an academic pursuit, really have to go back to about the 1970s, a little bit more recent. And if you were to summarize the difference between these two things, it would seem to me that management's about dealing with complexity, as you see here, and leadership's about dealing with change. And I used to work with a general officer who used to say, if you don't like change, you're going to like irrelevance even less. That being said, certainly we could postulate, if we use this definition, that Pol Pot, Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, Osama bin Laden were all great leaders because they decided what had to be done and got people actively to be involved with it. But I don't think any of us would agree with that. I don't think Eisenhower would either, were he on this call. But I think he would also fundamentally agree that leadership, the bedrock of leadership, establishing trust with a group of people, has to do with character, integrity, and ethics. Ultimately, leadership then is character in action. If you talked about why you would then specifically use Gettysburg, one last word on that, I would go back to this particular comment by a guy named Joshua Chamberlain, Colonel and Commander of the 20th Maine, and what his men do on the second day of the Battle of Gettysburg on Little Round Top is of singular importance in ensuring the Union has an opportunity to win the battle. In fact, if Joshua Chamberlain had failed or not done what he did, there's very little doubt the Union Army would have lost at Gettysburg, and you can spin out from there what actually happens. But he will return in 1889, as you see here, to give a speech at the dedication of a monument to his regiment, which is still there to this very day. And in his remarks, he will close them with this particular sentence: "And reverent men and women from afar, and generations that we know not of, heart drawn to see where and by whom great things were suffered and done for them, shall come to this deathless field to ponder and to dream." So in some ways, I think what Chamberlain was saying there kind of predicts, if you will, this Zoom meeting here in the 21st century, that we're going to go to this deathless field, albeit in a virtual environment, to ponder and to dream and see what we can learn from all this that might be useful for us. To think about Gettysburg, we have to think about how this comes about. And it comes about in the second year of the war. The war has gone on at this point for about 2 years. In the Eastern Theater, the Confederates have been very successful. Most recently, Robert E. Lee has effected a massive defeat of the Union Army of the Potomac at Chancellorsville. In the West, things are not going quite so well, and the Union Army is poised to take full control of the Mississippi. The last Confederate holdout is Vicksburg, and at the moment, Union General Ulysses S. Grant is besieging the Confederate garrison in Vicksburg. So what do the Confederates do? They do what almost any organization does at a critical moment. You've done it for organizations you've been part of, or at least participated in it. And that is, they have a strategic planning conference. What are we going to do consistent with our goals and objectives? They do that on the 14th of May. They do it in Richmond, and they invite the senior political and military leadership to attend, to include, of course, Robert E. Lee. They determined they have 3 options. As Henry Kissinger said, always have 3 options. And those are: 1, send part of the Army of Northern Virginia down to Mississippi and try to break that siege of Vicksburg. Number 2, send part of the Army of Northern Virginia to Central Tennessee, reinforce the Confederate Army there, and let that army advance north to threaten places like Cincinnati, perhaps, or Indianapolis, or maybe even Columbus, Ohio. And in so doing, if you will, further exacerbate the opposition to the war which exists in the central part of the United States, knowing full well that in 1864, there's going to be a presidential election. If we can defeat Abraham Lincoln, those who succeed may well then be willing to negotiate a settlement allowing us to become independent. Third option, advance north into Pennsylvania, find a piece of terrain, put the Confederate Army on it, let the Yankees attack us again, because we'd always done better on the defense, defeat them on northern territory, and that too may be a tipping point that may move us towards victory. This is the option Robert E. Lee prefers. He is persuasive, and the leadership agrees that is the option they pursue. He begins that particular campaign in June by, as you see here, advancing basically across the Appalachian Mountains and using the Shenandoah Valley as an avenue to advance north. He surprises the Union Army of the Potomac, who suddenly see that he's gone, and so the Yankees take off heading due north, trying to keep their force between Robert E. Lee and Washington, D.C., as they pursue north, trying to catch up. On the way, on the 28th of June, after a dispute between Thomas Fighting Joe Hooker, commander of the Union Army, and President Lincoln, either A, you can believe Hooker resigns, or B, you can believe that Lincoln fires him. But in any event, a courier arrives at the tent of one General George Gordon Meade, telling him that you are now in command. It's interesting, Meade would record in his diary, he said, "I thought I was being arrested." And the courier said, "No, it's worse than that, you're being put in command." So Meade is put in command 2 days before the battle, putting himself in a very different situation as a leader than his opponent, Robert E. Lee, who's been in command now about 16 months and been very, very successful. As they head north, Robert E. Lee sends out an order when he learns the Union Army has crossed the Potomac for them to consolidate at Gettysburg. Why Gettysburg? Well, if you look at this map, you can tell because a whole bunch of roads, about 8 or 9 roads pass through Gettysburg. It's, if you will, they're like spokes of a wheel. And therefore, with the 3 corps of the Confederate Army at disparate positions, it's the easiest place for us to consolidate. And they do that. But on the afternoon of 30 June, a guy named John Buford and his cavalry from the Union Army will arrive. They will occupy McPherson's Ridge just to the west of town, waiting for what they expect to be a Confederate advance the next morning. That will occur, and we're going to skip over day 1 very quickly. The Yankees are able to hold McPherson Ridge for a time. They are reinforced by infantry later in the day. But as the day goes on, the Confederates, now advancing from the west and from the north, overwhelm them, and the Union Army is forced to flee through the town of Gettysburg and occupy Cemetery Ridge. At that point, I'm going to turn it over to my good friend Tom Vossler to take it off for further history, and then we'll bring in some leadership lessons along the way. Tom, take it.
Thanks, Jeff, and good afternoon to all of you from my farm, located 1.5 miles from the first shot marker of the battle here on the west side of the battlefield. So by the end of the day, as Jeff has told you, the Confederate advance initially will force the Yankees back to a established reserve position on Cemetery Hill, located just south of the town. By the end of the second day, the following day, there will have been assembled here 95,000 Union soldiers, 75,000 Confederate, 72,000 horses and mules, over 600 cannon, hundreds of wagons filled with food and forage. But that's at the end of the second day. Here at the end of the first day, in combat are about 28,000 Confederates and 18,000 Union troops, and the Yankees will be pushed back to Cemetery Hill. Now, as the day passes on, the Confederates occupy the town and the ground around it. Over on Seminary Ridge, there's a meeting between the 2 senior commanders of the Confederate Army, General Robert Edward Lee, Lieutenant General James Longstreet. Longstreet is Lee's senior subordinate commander. And in fact, Lee refers often to Longstreet as my old war horse. And so Longstreet's been with Lee all 13 months that Lee's been in command of this Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, as it was called. And they're having a brief discussion there on Seminary Ridge. A mile to the east, they can clearly see the Union soldiers attempting to rally on that hill of Cemetery Hill, that reserve position that was established for them. And as Longstreet studies the situation and the terrain, he finally turns to Lee and he says to General Lee, he says, you know, General, he says, by tomorrow morning, that position will be too strongly defended for us to attack it successfully. And so if you're going to try and talk your boss out of doing something, you better have a good recommendation. Longstreet's recommendation was to move the Confederate Army in a south and southeasterly direction to maneuver their enemy off of Cemetery Hill rather than attack them directly there. Lee listens to Longstreet's suggestion and rejects it. And he points across, Lee points across the valley a mile away at the assembling Union soldiers there. And he tells Longstreet, he says, if those people are still there in the morning, we're going to attack them at that place. And Longstreet comes back and he says, General Lee, if those people are still there in the morning, it's because they want you to attack them at that place. Jeff, next slide, please. So Lee, of course, Lee is the commander and his orders will be obeyed. He will give an order at 8 o'clock in the morning for the Confederates to attack the Union position. Let's look at the Union position first. By the next day, as Longstreet has predicted, the Union position will have been established, even reinforced, as more regiments of infantry and batteries of artillery advanced to the sound of the guns of the fighting of the first day. By the second day, taking shape is a giant fish hook, the right end of which is anchored at Culp's Hill. And in the shape of a fish hook, that's the barbed end of the hook. You have the curve in the hook at Cemetery Hill, down Cemetery Ridge, and the line should have extended all the way down to the eye of the fish hook at Little Roundtop. However, one of the Union generals, Daniel Sickles, commander of the 3rd Army Corps, is operating outside of the orders given to him. he will, before the Confederate attack begins, advance his 10,000 men 3/4 of a mile forward of Cemetery Ridge toward the Confederates, and he creates a salient, that is, a defensive line subject to attack from 2 directions at the same time. So it's an awkward position for his 10,000 soldiers, and the Confederates, as you'll see, will take quick advantage of it. The Confederate attack will consist of a double envelopment. On the right end of the Confederate line, Longstreet with 2 divisions of infantry will attack the left end of the enemy line. And over on the other end, General Richard Ewell, also with 2 divisions, will attack the right end of the Union line. And that's the plan. Those are the orders issued at 8 o'clock in the morning. Now, the Confederate problem is getting the men into position to make the attack. No jeeps, no trucks, no helicopters. They got to march the infantry, in Longstreet's case, 16,000 men, march them into their attack positions from which to make the attack. And there are some problems along the way, which we could discuss perhaps at another time. But the short end of it is it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon before the Confederates are ready to make their attack. That's 8 hours since the orders were given, but they nonetheless will make their attack beginning at 4 o'clock. And that attack will begin to then collapse the line formed by General Sickles, and the attacking regiments and brigades of Confederate infantry will force the Union line back. Just before the Confederate attack began, the commander of the Union troops, General George Meade, will have realized Sickles had placed himself outside of the intended position, and Meade will consult with Sickles just prior to the Confederate attack about why did you come out here, you're in the wrong place. But then the Confederate artillery bombardment preceding the infantry attack begins. It's too late to try and move Sickles back to his original assigned position. So Meade will promise Sickles help in the form of reinforcements. The reinforcements will consist of an entire 4-brigade division from the 2nd Corps, numbering somewhere in the neighborhood of 8,000 men, and another 3-brigade division from the 5th Corps, numbering perhaps another 5,000 to 6,000 men. And while all this was going on, riding up on top of Little Roundtop, the hill there on the right-hand side, Little Roundtop, which should have been the eye of the fishhook, riding up there was the senior engineer of the Union Army, who's going to inspect the position. Brigadier General Gouverneur K. Warren, as the chief engineer in the defensive situation, his job is to inspect defenses. So he rides up there to inspect the defense of the hill, is horrified to find there's nobody here to defend the hill. When Sickles moved forward, he left no troops there to defend it. So General Warren will send one of his lieutenants, one of his aides de camp, one of his lieutenants, Lieutenant Randall McKenzie, down the hill, try and find reinforcements. The lieutenant will find a commander of a infantry brigade, numbering 100 soldiers, and a brief conversation will ensue. Jeff, next slide. And pictured here is Lieutenant McKenzie approaching Colonel Strong Vincent, a Harvard graduate and attorney from Erie, Pennsylvania. He's originally the commander of the 83rd Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry Regiment. Now he's a brigade commander of 1,400 men, consisting of 4 regiments. And so Vincent knows that this lieutenant works for Warren. Vincent knows Warren by reputation in this small army, and knows this, as I say, this lieutenant works for Warren. Vincent inquires, Lieutenant, do you have orders? And the lieutenant says, yes, sir. General Warren says we need infantry on yonder hill to defend it. And you can see in the picture there in the background on the right side, upper right corner, that is Little Roundtop as it looked in 1863. So here's Vincent's situation. He's under orders to take his 1,400 men to the wheat field to reinforce General Sickles. But yet here's new information from a trusted source. The problem is the trusted source, General Warren, is a staff officer. The staff officer who has no command authority over Vincent and his troops. So what's Vincent to do? He's got new information from a trusted source that it looks like, yeah, we probably should go there. But yet he's under orders to go to the wheat field. So what's he to do? Jeff.
Well, this brings up a leadership principle we think is critical, and that is initiative. Now, I took a poll from the group we have right here. We had a very large group of CEOs in the audience. We said, everyone opposed to initiative, please raise your hand. I don't think we'd see many hands raised. Everyone's in favor of initiative. The trick is, how do you create a climate whereby people feel empowered to execute without any direction, which is in essence what initiative is all about. And we, our research have discovered, if you will, kind of a paradigm or a framework to look at that we take from an old Air Force guy, which is called observe, orient, decide, and act, or often referred to as the OODA loop. Comes from this gentleman right here. His name is Colonel John Boyd. John Boyd was a fighter pilot during the Korean War. After the war is over, he becomes a trainer of fighter pilots. And Boyd creates this concept of the OODA loop to train fighter pilots, saying to them in essence, okay, here's what you got to do. As you're flying, you have to observe the environment in which you're operating. You have to orient on what the key variables that are changing in that particular environment are at that moment. You have to make a decision against one or more of those variables that you determine are critical, and you have to act. And you have to do that in a time cycle that's more quickly than your competition if you're going to be successful. I got the chance to spend time with John Boyd because after he leaves the Air Force and retires, he will write a number of books and articles about the OODA loop. He'll become a consultant to many large corporations and to the Department of Defense in using this concept for them, because in essence, that's what you all do in your organizations. That's what successful corporate people do. They observe the environment they're operating in. They orient on what the key things that are changing in that environment. We're certainly in a very rapidly and changing environment right now, for example. They make decisions against that, and they, in fact, act. And John said to me, he used to wager young pilots drinks after they got done training every day that they could take off together in 5 minutes. He could execute this more quickly than anybody, and he'd be on their tail. And he said to me in a very bashful, humble way, I never lost, okay? And that's supposed to be a joke, because if you spend any time around fighter pilots, you know the last thing they are humble or bashful. That is not necessarily an attribute one ascribes to fighter pilots. Another way of looking at this might be if you've read the book Blink by Malcolm Gladwell. In essence, in talking about decision-making, Gladwell makes, I would argue, the same point when he says, you know, decisions you make that quick are oftentimes every bit as good or better than the ones you ponder over for a longer and longer period of time. Well, there's good old strong Vincent, depicted as he was on Little Roundtop. As Tom pointed out to you, he could have in fact been court-martialed for doing that. He is violating his orders. That does not happen really for two reasons. Reason number one is I think most people in the Union Army agreed in the aftermath that was the right decision, number one. And number two is he gets killed in the fighting on Little Roundtop, so there's no real way to ascertain whether or not his leaders would have held him accountable for violating those orders. He clearly demonstrates that initiative. He clearly demonstrates that initiative that all leaders want to instill in their mid-level and subordinate management. Tom, let's take it to day 3.
All right, day 3. After understanding the results of day 2, the Confederate attack ordered by Lee, the main attack, Longstreet's troops attacking through the Peach Orchard, Wheatfield, Devil's Den, and Little Roundtop. They capture some ground, but they cannot capture the Little Roundtop. Over on the other end of the line, Richard Ewell's attack against the Union right, they capture part of, but not all of Culp's Hill. So in summation, for the second day, Confederates gained some ground, but no breakthrough. As a consequence, General Lee will then order an attack, another attack for the third day of the battle. This attack is going to take place against the center of the Union line. We believe that Lee's rationale for attacking there was the fact that the previous day they'd attacked the ends of the line and been stopped there, because the Yankees were strong there. And they can't be strong everywhere. If they're strong on the ends of the line, they've got to be weak in the center. So he'll order, again, his old war horse, James Longstreet. He tells him, look, what I want you to do is take the 2 divisions that you attacked with yesterday, plus Pickett's fresh division. George Pickett commands a division of 6,000 Virginians. They didn't get to the battlefield until the end of the second day, so they were the only fresh unit that they have. So here's a conversation going on. We've got the figures there. You've got Lee with a white beard. You got Longstreet pointing out the enemy position behind them. The fellow with the ostrich plume in his hat, that's the Confederate Cavalry Commander James Ewell Brown Stewart. And so they're going to have this conversation. Lee tells Longstreet to make the attack. Longstreet simply turns to Lee and he says, General Lee, he says, the two divisions I attacked with yesterday were heavily handled. They've taken a lot of casualties and they're in no condition to attack again today. Besides which, if we move forward from where we are now, the Yankee cavalry will get around us, get in our rear, attack us in the rear. Lee processes that response and then says, all right, I'll give you two divisions from A.P. Hill's Corps. Ambrose Powell Hill commanded the Confederate 3rd Corps. Lee says, I'll give you two divisions from A.P. Hill's Corps, take them and Pickett's division, attack the center of the line, attack the center of the Yankee line. Now for Longstreet, this second order is no better than the first order. So he summons up all his moral courage and he turns to Lee and he says, General Lee, he says, I've been a soldier all my life. He says, I commanded soldiers by regiments and brigades and divisions and now this fine corps. He says, I should know as well as any man what soldiers can and cannot do. And General Lee, I'm here to tell you, there are no 15,000 men ever arrayed for battle can carry that position. Lee's response was, General, we must follow our orders. And so discussion is closed and preparations will be made for the attack against the Union position. Let's go to the next chart. The Union position there in blue, let's cover that first. The overall commander in the center of the Union line is General Winfield Scott Hancock, and they'll have a position on Cemetery Hill, which is denoted today by a couple areas called the angle, which denotes an angle, and the stone wall, which ran along the front of the defensive position that the Union will defend from and the Confederates will attack against. Also, there's a group of trees, copse of trees located there in the center of the objective area. Look at the upper right picture there. There's the copse of trees as viewed from the Confederate artillery line, just forward of Seminary Ridge, and you can see a Confederate cannon there. And so 1.1 mile of open ground between where the Confederate infantry will launch their attack and where the Union defenders are. So the lower picture there shows you the opposite view. This is the view of the Union defenders. You can make out the slight stone wall there running at the base of this memorial to one of the Pennsylvania regiments that defended there. And you can look across again, the open terrain, the flat open terrain. It's actually slightly rolling. It's hard to see in this picture, but not a lot of concealment, not hardly any concealment there at all. You can see all the way over to Seminary Ridge denoted by the tree line. And so all total, 12,500 infantry are going to make this attack. Longstreet thought he was going to get 15,000, but neither he nor Lee understood the extent of the casualties that the two divisions from A.P. Hill had taken in the first day's fighting, 48 hours earlier. Not to say poor staff work, just non-existent staff work compared to what we have in the 21st century. So you have a lack of information made in putting this attack together. So that attack of the infantry will take place after a 2-hour artillery bombardment by an estimated 150 cannon. 150 Confederate cannon will open fire just after 1 p.m. July 3rd. In response, initially, the Union cannon that accompanied the 6,000 defending infantry, Union infantry on Cemetery Ridge, there's about 40 cannon over there initially. They'll open fire against the Confederate artillery, and it's battery, counter-battery fire. But then Union artillery goes silent to conserve their ammunition. They know there'll be an infantry attack to follow. More artillery pieces are brought up to join the 6,000 defending infantry. And so finally, just after 3 p.m., the Confederate infantry will make their march forward across 1.1 mile of open ground. As they come out into the field, then it becomes a true target-rich environment for the artillerymen, and they opened fire into the ranks of the approaching Confederate, the marching Confederate infantry. If you were in the ranks of the Confederates that afternoon, you would have heard leaders using phrases like, "Home, boys, home. Home is just over that hill. Keep moving forward, man. The firing can't last much longer." In other words, if they get up there and capture the Union position, win the battle, perhaps it'll end the war, and then go home. So there's a lot at stake here for the Confederates. And onward they advanced. Their battle line was a mile from south to north as they started, and they come across the fields. They get to the Emmitsburg Road, and there are stout post and rail fences on both sides of that road, which they either have to climb over or try to push down. It's very difficult, but they do come across the road, except for the fact that the battle line that was a mile from south to north when they started is now only a quarter of a mile, starting from just below the Cordero Farm all the way up to Ziegler's Grove. And so they attacked the center of the Union position, and they come into actually a bayonet charge against the stone wall where the Union defenders are. Brigadier General Lewis Armistead had taken off his hat and stuck it on the end of his sword and called out to his men. He said, "Who will follow me over the wall?" And over the wall is Armistead with about, we believe, we'll never know for sure, about 300 men go over the wall with Armistead. And Armistead is shot down, mortally wounded, and he'll die in a Union hospital the next day. The 300 men who came over the wall with Armistead are killed or captured. For all practical purposes, this is going to end the fighting at Gettysburg because Pickett's charge, as it's called, is defeated. Pickett's division of 6,000 men will suffer 62% casualties. Understand it this way too. In Pickett's division, of the 6,000 men, 2 of every 3 men are killed, wounded, captured, or simply never seen again. Jeff.
As they return across the field, those who survive, this is a painting that depicts that Robert E. Lee had positioned himself near the center of the Confederate line on the Seminary Ridge to observe the attack. So as the retreating Confederates who survive make their way towards him, many of them will come up to General Lee and they'll say, General Lee, let us reform our line and attack that position again. We will take it this time. And Lee goes, no, it's all my fault. You have to help me now. General Pickett will come up to Lee and Lee will say to him, General Pickett, prepare your division for the defense. Lee worrying that the Yankees might counterattack. Pickett's response is, General Lee, I don't have a division anymore. They're all gone. The Yankees do not attack, of course, and the next day, late in the afternoon, as it begins to rain, Robert E. Lee will begin to withdraw the Confederate Army from Gettysburg and from Pennsylvania. Many people question Lee's generalship during these 3 days. However, his generalship, I would argue, in the aftermath is probably some of his best, as he is able to get the Confederate Army safely across the Potomac and back into Virginia. But it seems to us the leadership lesson here is this question of authority versus responsibility. As one moves up into positions of greater and greater responsibility in any organization, he or she has to give authority to others. You cannot do everything, but responsibility still rests with you. These words may be used interchangeably, and that is imprecise. And Robert E. Lee will accept full responsibility for what occurs at Gettysburg. In the aftermath, he will write a letter to Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederacy, offering to resign because of their defeat at Gettysburg. Davis will reject that, saying, you are still the best commander I have. And of course, Lee stays in command until the 9th of April, 1865, when he will surrender to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse. But from now until then, or until the end of the war, and even beyond until he dies about 5 years after the war, Lee continues to accept full responsibility for what occurs at Gettysburg. In my research, and Tom and I have talked about this a good bit, we have found no case where he blames Jeb Stuart, which we don't talk about much today, who is missing in action for about a week as they're moving north in the first 2 days of the battle. He doesn't criticize Richard Ewell for getting the battle started there on the first day prior to the Confederate Army being prepared. He doesn't criticize, I should say, A.P. Hill for getting the battle started, or Richard Ewell for not pursuing vigorously on the end of the first day. nor does he criticize Peter Longstreet for what many people believe was moving very slowly on the second day to commit that attack that Tom described. No, Robert E. Lee accepts full responsibility. And we've seen that in modern times, of course, with that famous plaque that Harry Truman used to put on his desk in the White House, which simply said, "The buck stops here. Ultimate responsibility rests with me. Ultimate responsibility rests with the leader." We've often talked, Tom and I, that the full story of Gettysburg has got to include the speech, because the speech is such a large part of this particular story. So we're going to conclude by talking about the speech and what I think any leader can draw from the Gettysburg Address and from Abraham Lincoln's actions. It's interesting to reflect on the fact, or the following question, I guess I should say, if you were Abraham Lincoln, why would you show up? Here is the invitation he receives to make a few appropriate remarks, and he gets that invitation on the 2nd of November for a speech on the 19th, about 2.5 weeks later. That's kind of late in the game. Presidents don't travel that much during the American Civil War. There's a lot going on in November of 1863 as far as the war being prosecuted, particularly in the South. Secondarily, Mr. Lincoln is not the primary speaker. In fact, the primary speaker is a political opponent. More on him in a second. Thirdly, his wife is adamant that he not go because their only son, who's still surviving in the White House, Tad, is quite ill, and Mrs. Lincoln believes the child will die. And the Lincolns had lost a son, Willie, who had died in February of 1862. So for all those reasons, you might say, well, why would he go? And I often argue that the one resource that leaders manage, which is the most precious, is time. And part of that particular piece of analysis is timing. When is the right moment to do something? And that is a critical thing all leaders need to think through. It's my firm belief Lincoln goes to Gettysburg because of the timing of it for a number of reasons. One, he realizes that it's only 1 year from the election. He's not favored to win that election. Oh, by the way, number one, in fact, many people in the Republican Party think he should not even be renominated. But this is a moment when every governor, every senator, most of the congressmen, every newspaper will be present in Gettysburg for this particular event. So it's a key moment for him to, if you will, or have his staff mend political fences as they begin that next political struggle. Secondly, when is the right moment for any leader to convey a revised or expanded vision for the organization is a key question. And I think that's part and parcel of what Lincoln's all about. More on that in a second. This is the principal speaker. His name is Edward Everett, pretty distinguished guy, well-known orator. Many people argue Lincoln owes him a debt of gratitude because the 15,000 people that show up probably come to hear Everett because he's so well-known. He was a congressman, U.S. senator, governor of Massachusetts, ambassador to Great Britain, and former Secretary of State. He had covered all those things, had an amazing resume. He had also been the vice presidential candidate on the Union Party ticket in 1860. So he really is an opponent of Abraham Lincoln's politically. And in fact, it's interesting, Mr. Everett gets his invitation on the 23rd of September and also insists they postpone the initial date for the event because he needs more time to deliver or prepare his remarks. Everett will speak for 2 hours. And once he is done, Lincoln will then rise and deliver the Gettysburg Address, which is 272 words. We believe this is a photograph of Lincoln at Gettysburg that is unconfirmed. But as you see, he's sitting down. Many people wonder why that would be the case. And I believe it's because, of course, photography is in its infancy in the 19th century. Nobody told the photographer the president's only going to speak for about 3 minutes. He's still messing around with the camera. Lincoln finishes and sits down. The speech was not that widely received. And in fact, Mr. Lincoln will sit down and reportedly turns to an aide and says, that dog didn't hunt too well. And for example, the Patriot News here in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, not far from where Tom and I live, actually described it, or the correspondent described it in the following terms. The president made a few foolish remarks yesterday at Gettysburg. I'll give them credit. In 2013, they did print a retraction. But the Gettysburg Address, I think, serves as a, if you will, a framework that frankly any leader, small or large organization, can use when speaking to his or her organization and talking to them about their vision for where the organization should go. What are those 3 parts? Well, very quickly, the first part, where have we been 77 years ago, taking you back to 1776? the foundation document for the nation and Lincoln's belief. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Where are we right now as an organization? Well, according to Lincoln, we're on the great battlefield of this war. It's right and proper that we should do this. Where are we going? What is the vision that you're trying to convey? A nation shall have a new birth of freedom. So I would argue with you that as those 15,000 people arrive in the cemetery for that particular service, the purpose of the war up until that point had been to preserve the Union. That's what Lincoln talked about in the first inaugural address. In fact, the Emancipation Proclamation actually is focused on that, preserving the Union by depriving the South of free labor they were using to prosecute the war. And furthermore, it did not end slavery in Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, or Missouri, which were slave states, and only ended slavery in the states under rebellion. So you could argue in the aftermath of the war, when states returned, they should have their property returned. Then when those 15,000 people depart the cemetery, now Lincoln has expanded the vision. Yes, it's still about preserving the Union, but it's preserving the Union with a new birth of freedom, the end of slavery. And he will insist in 1864, really opposed by many senior Republicans, that that is a plank in the Republican Party platform as they pursue re-election in 1864. Obviously, you know they're successful. And in early 1865, of course, we have the 13th Amendment and the end of slavery in the United States. That, ladies and gentlemen, is a very quick summary of the battle and a handful of leadership insights along the way. The need for strategic planning, the idea of the importance of initiative, authority versus responsibility, and thinking through timing and revising a strategic vision. We have a large number of other insights, of course, and analysis throughout the book Battle Tested, as Tom Reynolds was so kind to suggest. Now, this is where the book is available at Barnes & Nobles and Amazon. If you send us a note, if you decide to purchase a copy, we'll be happy to mail you free of charge an autographed bookplate from both Tom and I, and you can get more information about what we do at Diamond Six more broadly in terms of our corporate workshops, either through our website or by emailing us directly. I want to conclude with one thing, and that is John Meacham once observed that history will surely be our judge, can also be our guide to the future. Tom and I like to say, leaders learn from the past to prepare for the future. I like this particular quote, which actually comes from an 8th century inscription on a church in Sussex, England, which in many ways summarizes the vision that Lincoln had in the Gettysburg Address, or perhaps the vision any leader might have for his or her organization. So I'll read that to you to conclude. A vision without a task is but a dream. A task without a vision is drudgery, and a vision and a task is the hope of the world. At that point, I'm going to stop sharing. I thank you very much for your attention, and we would be delighted to take any questions.
So this is
Jeff,
Linda.
great job. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate what you assembled.
Linda.
Thank you so much. I have a question for you that goes back to the part of the discussion about senior leaders under the senior most leader that in theory have been given orders and now they're out in the field. And I'm curious from both of you, where's the trade-off between initiative on the one hand and potentially ambition and conceit of people who have risen in their careers and have job titles that they believe grant them authority, responsibility, and so on, who decide in the moment whether or not to accept direction as an order and follow it.
Tom, you want to take a crack at that, or you want me to start?
Well, I'm not sure that I fully understand the question.
Well, let me take a crack. I'll take a crack at it, and if I don't hit the ball right, Linda, you'll come back to me, okay? It's a really good question, a really good question. And one could fall back on the comment that, you know, success has 1,000 fathers and mothers and failure is an orphan, okay? So if it works well, it must have been good, right? There are those who would argue, for example, that, here Tom may want to comment in a moment, that Dan Sickles shows amazing initiative by moving his force out to the front. and serves as, if you will, kind of a breakwater for that attack as it comes in. Okay, I think that's a very charitable way of looking at it. But I think the difference becomes, does this person make this choice? And that's what you have to evaluate. Is he or she making that choice for their own benefit or for the organization's benefit? And if you read books like Good to Great by Jim Collins, he talks about level 5 leadership. Level 5 leadership is the ability to make decisions which are best for the organization completely, and to divorce your own personal gain from that. Which at first blush, we might all say, well, hell, that sounds pretty simple. But no, it's not at all, because each one of us, let's be honest, each one of us has got a certain amount of ego, right? We want to be successful. So, but I think it comes down to just that. Am I doing this for the best of the organization or for myself? In the case of Dan Sickles, I think it's more for himself, because he wants to distinguish himself. When the battle's over, he'll write accounts of how wonderful he was under a pseudonym, and eventually gets the Medal of Honor. I can't imagine Strong Vincent saw this as a moment of him doing something that was totally for himself, okay? He saw it as what was best for the organization. One final comment, historical and more modern. If you want to take this whole battle, you could argue, and then I'm going to throw it to Tom for him to comment on this one, and it boils down to 2 leaders and the question of initiative. Because on the first day, and we skipped over this, Richard Ewell, whose guys have driven the Yankees through Gettysburg, he gets an order from Robert E. Lee, which Lee says, take that hill, meaning Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill, if you deem it practical to do so. And for a host of reasons, Ewell decides not to do that. There are tons of books that would tell you now in retrospect that if he had done that, shown some initiative, it'd have been a one-day battle and a Confederate victory, that they would have pushed the Yankees off those particular hills. And then on the second day, of course, you got the story of Strong Vincent. So 2 leaders, 2 hills, and the question of initiative make all the difference for the organization. An interesting read on this topic, which gets right to your point, is the book, The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, which really is all about one guy. I won't give the book away. It's a good read. I'd recommend it to you. It all boils down to me, to one guy on the team who's a really good, effective member of the team. That makes it even harder. Who really is putting his own personal gain ahead of the success of the organization. And that makes it even harder, because how do I get rid of somebody who's not only violating what's best for us, but he's actually a pretty effective member of the team? Tom, you want to come in on that?
I'd like to go back, Linda, to the example of Sickles, and that he's going to operate outside of the orders given to him. And this was, unfortunately, this was typical of Sickles. Now, having spent 30 years in the military, you know, I recall a culture that would have identified a lot earlier this type of behavior and eliminated that individual from further service, you see. But in this case, for Sickles, he's a former congressman. He's not, he became a soldier by appointment of the president, really, in fact, using his own money, his family's wealth, to raise 5 regiments of infantry in New York City. That's how he gets started in all this. So anything beforehand in that culture that would have eliminated him and his overbearing manner would have eliminated from service. He wasn't exposed to that, so therefore he is there. And then he will then turn around and he will be the chief protagonist against the Union Commander Meade at Gettysburg before the Congressional Committee on the Conduct of the War. He will turn and attack Meade even though Meade achieves a decisive victory over Robert Edward Lee, Sickles is part of that. So that's just that kind of character. But it's kind of summing up that operating within a culture that would have earlier identified that kind of an attitude and eliminated the problem.
Yeah, I just had one final word. This is also a screaming, I think, endorsement for development of mid-level management, because obviously Sickles had almost no preparation. Richard Ewell, who's a Confederate Corps commander, his highest rank in the Federal Army had been captain, and he made it to captain and sat there for 20 years. Obviously wasn't distinguishing himself. So because of the war, you have this unbelievable expansion, and people are promoted into positions far above their Peter principle or their preparation. Yeah, Peter.
Hey, guys, I have an interesting or a question that's of interest to me. The initiative thing I see when someone has two conflicting orders and they're put into
Right.
a place with judgment. I was intrigued by your conversation about Longstreet and Lee talking the second day about, I know this is going to be a disaster, right? And the dynamic of how do you follow an order that you know is going to lead to disaster, right? Because oftentimes we're faced with those as leaders in an organization. And I can think it's even tougher because those two guys had such a long relationship, you might default to trusting someone. But in this, because of your working relationship, but in this case, it was truly disastrous. Lee owns it, but what are your thoughts on the leadership dynamic in that world?
Go ahead, Tom. I'll let you start with that.
Well, this is exactly what we call, Peter, this is what we call Longstreet's dilemma. In other words, it's a question of loyalty, right? Loyalty for him, as it involves his organization, is identifying the fact that this attack might not succeed. And whether it does or not, is going to be high casualties for the organization, for my men. Okay, that's one side of it. The other thing that Longstreet's dilemma brings forward is then his loyalty to his commander. As I pointed out, he and Lee have been a command team for over a year. And within that time frame, then they have certain expectations of each other. They've learned how to resolve perhaps any differences they might earlier have had, but this one is probably the toughest nut to crack, as you put it in those terms. So it is, in fact, Longstreet's dilemma. How do you tell an icon? And Robert Edward Lee, by this time in the war, is an icon. How do you tell an icon that he's wrong?
Right.
And to get him to back down, to change his mind, to modify whatever. Longstreet the conversation was a lot more involved than what I portrayed. There's a lot more give and take into that sequence. But given time, you'll have to come out and I'll share it with you in further detail. But yeah, it's a difficult, and we write about it in the book, and we refer to it as Longstreet's dilemma.
Yeah, it is truly a moral dilemma. And let me bring it up to a 20th or 21st century example for you, Peter, in that, by the way, this is all off the record, right, Tom Reynolds? I always apply what I call the Las Vegas rule to my workshops.
Las Vegas, what happens
stays in Vegas. What happens in this call stays on the call. Okay.
Right.
I always argue that the moral dilemmas are the most challenging. These guys are confronted with numerous opportunities for them to show physical courage. The physical courage, some cases is easy. It's very black and white. You either confront it or you run away. So it's kind of black and white. Moral dilemmas, you can wrestle with your conscience and win if you're not careful. And one key thing you got to do is you got to have somebody around you. Now he has it in this case. He decides not to pursue it, he being Lee. But one of the important things you need to do is everybody needs somebody to tell them when they are violating what I used to call is the duck rule. If it looks like a duck, if it walks like a duck, people are going to call it a duck. Now, what's my point back to the Las Vegas rule? I worked in the Clinton White House on the National Security Council staff. I was assigned there as a military officer on the NSC staff, working on European security issues. And I'll tell you two things about Bill Clinton. We're not close bosom buddies, we're not on Christmas card list together, but there's two things I can tell you about Bill Clinton that I am adamantly convinced of, and I think anybody who encounters him will agree. Number one, this is a very smart man. This is not a dumb man at all. Very, very smart man, number one. Number two, he is a charismatic man. For charisma, chutzpah, whatever the hell you want to call it, the boy's got it, okay? He can be on this call, walk into a room, he'll light it up. There's just no two, and people like him. I've had people go into meetings I talk with, totally disagreeing with what the policy position was, come out of the meeting and say to me, well, I still disagree with him, but you have to like this guy. You cannot dislike this guy, okay? So you could say he was set up for success by that particular effort, huh? But what he didn't have was that one person who could walk in the room, close the door, and say, hey, look, Mr. President, you're a smart guy and all that kind of stuff. But you, the intern in here, door closed, dude, you know, it doesn't pass the giggle test, okay? You shouldn't be doing this. This is and nobody did that. And if they had, hell, our whole history would be different. So I'm saying everybody needs that particular voice. Doesn't mean you have to take it. We were fortunate, Tom and I, in the military, because the military as a culture institutionalizes that. At every level of command, there's a senior non-commissioned officer, platoon sergeant, first sergeants, command sergeant major. And he or she's job is to walk in the office, as mine would do when I was battalion commander, close the door. He'd have a cigarette in one hand, a cup of coffee in the other. He would tell me how bad I was going to screw up. He would intersperse all kinds of four-letter words in that particular description, and he'd put "sir" at the end of the paragraph. Okay, but that is crucially important just to keep you focused on true north. There are numerous other corporate examples. If you have had the opportunity, you should watch or look at a film called Smartest Guys in the Room. Smartest Guys in the Room is about the collapse of Enron. And if you watch the collapse of Enron, what you discover, and this is the second mistake leaders can make, is inadvertently get themselves in a bubble where only good news gets to them. And that's what I believe. He died before we got to the bottom of it. I believe that's what Ken Lay did, okay? Only good news could get to him. And one of his vice president is still making money giving inspirational talks about how she was sending him emails saying, we're going to collapse in a wave of accounting scandals, which he either ignored or never got to it. But that moral dilemma question is the toughest one, harder than physical. The only way to abate or reduce the risk of it is have people around you who will tell you God's honest truth as unabashedly as you can get it, number one. And number two, make sure you don't inadvertently get yourself, in a bubble where only good news, and you can do that by shooting the messenger. If somebody comes into you with bad news and you shoot them, guess what? After a while, bad news won't come to you. I guarantee it. People learn pretty quick. All right. Sorry, Peter.
No, that's great. And I think that's actually great advice. And the second thing is I've read a lot of military history, never served, but I didn't know that was the institutionalized role of the non-com versus the commissioned officers. I've never heard them put that way, and that's great.
I'll give you a way. After I retired, I sat down with a couple of my old sergeant majors one night over dinner. We had a couple of beers. And I said to them, I said, okay, when you guys get together, when you were still in uniform, you talked about us, didn't you? And they kind of looked around and went, yeah, as a matter of fact, we did. And I said, what did you think your role was? And what I found fascinating, this is a matter of organizational culture. They all said to me, what we talk and think about is our job is to defend the colors. Each regiment has a regimental flag. Our job is to defend the colors. Not defend you, oh, by the way, but defend the reputation of the organization. And obviously, you doing something unethical or totally untoward brings disgrace on the organization.
That's interesting. Yeah. Thanks, guys. This has been great.
And one of the critical issues here is that the decisions made under military circumstances result in thousands of dead people. In organizational life, it may be loss of profits, loss of jobs, loss of reputation. In the military, it's much more significant.
Yeah, though it's still pretty severe. I mean, I go back to Enron. Okay. This is a company that, Ken Lay, he's dead now, so we can talk about it. He is still urging members of the corporation to put their money in Enron stock while he's selling his, oh, by the way. And Enron stock goes from a pretty high number to a couple of pennies almost overnight. These people all lose their jobs, lose everything they have. Another example might be, you could look at this is where you can wrestle your conscience and win. The Atlanta School District, okay? Somebody decides what we're gonna do is we're gonna alter test scores for students. And we can rationalize this because if we do this, we'll have higher scores, which will mean we'll get more federal and state aid. So actually doing this is a good thing. I can wrestle with my conscience and win, okay? They do that, all right? More people become aware of it. We do it this year. Well, then we got to do it a little bit more next year. So we change a few more tests and it goes on. When this all blows, just like Enron, a number of these people go to prison for fraud. So yeah, they don't die, but I mean, it's still pretty devastating, and it all comes from moral dilemmas and poor moral choice.
I would like to say, too, in response to Linda's question, that the comparison of civil military, the common ground is the leadership competencies, which we write about in the book, which we speak about in our presentations, which we give in our seminars, and that we believe that these leadership competencies apply universally to military or corporate. They are universal over time, universal over occupation, and universal over nationality. And so that's, and the bottom line is really, we're talking about people leading people. And that's where we put our emphasis.
Just real quick, because we're over our time, and everybody's welcome to stay and please stay and listen. And this will probably open up another can of worms for Jeff, particularly, is that I remember Jeff saying to me years ago when the Iran war first started that we were putting in non-professional.
We don't have an Iran war yet. Iraq war. Go ahead.
Iraq, excuse me.
Stick with Iraq.
Yeah.
That
when we started fighting, that these were not trained military officers, that there were a lot of reserve officers who have a different set of training, and it's a different outcome. And to me, that was really fascinating, because I think sometimes when the public hears the military is doing something, we assume it's a trained army, and in some cases it might not. Am I right here, Jeff? Is this an accurate?
Yeah, but I don't want in any way, shape, or form, criticize guys in the Guard and Reserve. They're great.
No.
They're patriots.
Yeah.
But like in this situation as well, I mean, good old Don Rumsfeld, who I got the chance to spend a good deal of time with, and that's a story unto itself. Maybe my next book will be that one. And
and I'll write the chapter about his visit to Gettysburg.
There you go.
I was his battlefield guy.
There you go. But a very smart guy. I'll make one. Well, in fact, I'll make one comment about Don, which may be instructive on this when we're thinking about it. First of all, I'll tell you, he's a very smart guy. Number one. Okay. Number two is in meetings that you go with Don Rumsfeld. He and some of you may have had this experience. I certainly have, where you work for somebody where we have a meeting, and the first thing the boss has got to do is establish that he or she is the smartest person in the room. So we play the game of 20 questions until we've proven that I'm the smartest person in the room. And once we've got that established, then we can go on to whatever the agenda was. Well, let me tell you, this was Don Rumsfeld to a T. And then last, I was tell you what this guy, I knew a very senior guy that worked for him, said one time. And I said, what's working for Rumsfeld like? And he said, well, it's like this. If we were all walking together down the E-ring, which is the outside ring of the Pentagon, and he had a coronary, I'd go look for a telephone to call for first aid, but I'd probably walk over to the office to get the phone, which I thought was a pretty telling comment about his ability to inspire. But he was really a smart guy, and he said some things that were absolutely correct. And one is, he said, to Tom's point, you go to war with the army you got. Okay, and this is played out in Gettysburg. Richard Ewell, captain, and now 3-star general. Abner Doubleday, founder of baseball, is a division commander at Gettysburg. In April of 1861, he's at Fort Sumter, and he is a captain of about 80 guys. Okay, hell, it took me and Vossler 18 years to get to be a doggone colonel, for God's sake. There's one guy who's a colonel at Gettysburg who graduated from West Point about 2 years prior to that, okay? Which is really unfair if it took you 18. But the point of the matter is, you're going to war with the army you got. In the same words, for you all, if you're leading your company, your corporation, your organization, and you have a crisis of your own, I'm gonna deal with this crisis with the team I got. Unless I got scads of money and I can hire all kinds of consultants, you might be able to do that, I guess. But to some degree, you're going to have to rely on the team you got. So every leader, I would argue, needs to do two things every day. I don't care if you're leading a big organization, a small one, a military, a church, a non-for-profit, whatever you're leading. The two things you do every day is, one, you execute whatever the mission is for your organization. We sell light bulbs, we sell trucks, we make things, whatever we do that keeps the lights on. And I've got to continue to develop my team. That's the second thing I got to do every day. I got to continue to develop my team. And if I'm a large organization, I got to develop a team that can carry on after I'm gone, because the real measure, I would argue, of any leader is how well his or her organization does 6 months after they're gone. If it collapses, I would say you weren't a very good leader. You didn't do a very good job in creating an organization that was sustainable and could sustain success over time, which is the ultimate goal.
Thank you.
Tom, you're muted, my friend.
That was really great. I think, you know, we're about a half hour over my usual limit, but this has been so fascinating. Are there any other questions real quick, or, you know, I think we'll, you know, conclude it now.
Yeah, and you all, once again, if you want to send me an email at info@diamond6, spell out the 6, leadership.com. If you've got another question, I'll be happy to try to give you an answer. And once again, as a reminder, if you do decide to purchase the book and you send us an email at that book plate at Diamond6, or you can send it to info, one or the other, we will be happy to send you a book plate.
And I'll tell you right now, the book is really worth reading. It's not only great history, but it's great leadership. So
I didn't pay him in advance.
And I did put that on the Amazon. At least I hope I did. I'm not very good at that as a recommendation. So anyway, thank you all for coming, and thank you, Jeff and Tom. You guys are unbelievable. This was great, and I look forward to seeing the video.
Thanks
Thank you very much.
Thanks, you guys.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye.
Stay well.
Thanks, guys.